Good morning, scholars. Today we're going to continue our way through Pharr's Homeric Greek, a book for beginners, looking at the phenomenon of indirect discourse, otherwise known as Oratio Obliqua. Now, indirect discourse is the opposite or is opposed to the phenomenon of direct discourse. Direct discourse, or Oratio Recta, in a direct quotation, the words or thoughts quoted are given at first hand in the exact form used by the original speaker or thinker. So this is just quoting exactly what someone said. And this example here is a long one from Herodotus, which I don't want to take time reading. I'll go directly to A. Direct quotation may, in prose, be introduced by hote, which has the value of quotation marks. Thus, hode epon hoti ikanoi esmen, but they said that we are ready. So usually, when the finite verb is omitted, as in apekrinato hoti u, he answered no. He answered that no. The use of direct speech introduced by hoti is in general that of a familiar style. Okay, and so this is what you see in the New Testament, something like that non-literary Gospel of Mark. Jesus's actual statements will be presaged by hote, which is nothing more than the equivalent of quotation marks. And you have to consider as well something like the Platonic hedego, which is the use of a rather obscure verb of saying eme, which is equivalent to Latin io, say, and occurs only in the present and imperfect first and third singular, and is used in parentheses like Latin inquam, inquit. The forms heme, hese, hein, he. So your example, pi, eme, pi. Boy, I say boy. And that's emphatic repetition. But what you see in Plato all the time is this heindego or heidos. I said heindego, and he said heidos. And here you have ego and hos being forms of the personal pronoun used as forms of the personal pronoun, the demonstrative being used that way. So, to read 11:13, as a personal pronoun, chiefly after kai, and in the nominative, kai hos or kai he, and he and she. So thus you have something like kai hoi epon, and they said. But also, heidos, he said, and as I said, hein dego, I said. And anyone who's read Plato's Republic realizes that the whole dialogue is carried on as something in the first person of Socrates. So this hein dego, eidos, those expressions carry most of the dialogue, or I should say the book, the various parts of the Republic. So, but you can even have kaiton, kaitain, used as the accusative of kai hos when it's the subject of a following infinitive in indirect discourse. So here, this ton has been introduced by, say, a verb like epe, and he said that he, and the ton is your subject of the infinitive, and he said that kai ton epein, and he said that he said. So that's from Plato Symposium, line 174, the very beginning of it, which we'll look at just because it's such a fun passage, even though not all of it will make sense to you. So, Apollodorus basically says, ex arches humin hos ekenos diegeto kai ego perasomai diegesastai. Okay, from the very beginning to you, as that one, related it, also I shall try to relate it. And this is, of course, the relating of the famous symposium at which Socrates and Aristophanes and ultimately Alcibiades discoursed about love. So to continue, epe, so here we have epe, he said, epe gar hoi Socratein intukein, le lumenon te kaitas blautas hupodemenon, ha ekenos oligarchis epoie, kai erestai auton, hopoi ioi huto kalos gegenemenos. So, I'll read it again. Epe gar hoi Socratein intukein, le lumenon te kaitas blautas hupodemenon, ha ekenos oligarchis epoie, kai erestai auton, hopoi ioi huto kalos gegenemenos. And he said that Socrates, ran into him. This hoi is the dative personal pronoun, and referring back to the speaker. So Socrates, he said that Socrates ran into him, and Socrates le lumenon and hupodemenon. Socrates was washed, scrubbed up, and wearing slippers, because usually Socrates went about not necessarily very well washed and with bare feet, dirty bare feet, and a raggedy cloak. But in this case, he was le lumenon te kaitao blaustas hupodemenon, wearing sandals and all scrubbed up. Ha ekenos oligarchis epoie, which that one very rarely was in the habit of doing. And kai erestai, and he asked auton him, and he asked him, hopoi ioi, where would he be going? Huto kalos gegenemenos, where would he be going? So beautifully gotten up. Kai ton epen, and ton epen, and ton epen. And he said, hoti, that he was going epidepnon eis agatonos, to a dinner, to a meal in the house of Agathon. So, kai ton epen hoti epidepnon eis agatonos. Okay, so this is kind of, jumping ahead. But by the end of this lecture, you will have a better sense of what these structures that are being used here to report this reported speech. Okay. So the first thing is that we have the verb epe. He said, or he was saying. And we see this verb even here in our first book of the Iliad, line 57, where we've seen toisi danistamenos metepe podas okus akilos. So rising to them, or in front of them, before them, swift-footed Achilles spoke among them. Epe, he spoke and said, and then you get the direct words of his speech. So that's the most common way in Homer that a direct quotation of a speech will be generated. And likewise, we've seen ho sepato, thus he spoke, to kind of resume the narrative after a quoted speech. So there's a lot of, Homer is dominated by direct speeches, and that carries the movement back and forth between narration and speech. Whereas in other works, like Herodotus, Plato, and Thucydides, and all over the place, you will have a bigger share of indirect discourse. or Oratio Obliqua. In an indirect quotation, the words or thoughts are given at secondhand with certain modifications to indicate that the words or thoughts are reported. Okay, so ABC. A, the original form may be preserved except that there is a change from the first or second person to the third person. So, pant atele domini, he wishes to give everything, is a report of pant etelo domini, I wish to give everything. So you change that first person. He said, I wish to return to give everything. You turn that, if you're reporting it, to he said he wishes to return everything. Now B, the narrator may report in dependent form the words or thoughts of a person from the point of view of that person. And this is the common form of indirect discourse, where the narrator is just reporting the words from the point of view of the original speaker. But then you have the third, more complicated case where a narrator may report in dependent form the words or thoughts of a person from his own point of view, i.e. from the point of view of the speaker. And you can look at section 2624 of Smythe if you want to look at that third and most complex case. But we are sticking with the basics here. So we'll be looking at three types. Type 1, specimen A and specimen B, and then type 2, which will amount to 3. So in type 1A, you have indirect discourse expressed through the infinitive. So you have an introductory verb of perception or speaking or such, and then you have an accusative subject. The subject would be an accusative, and the infinitive main verb. So in this upcoming speech of Achilles, we have oio hame aponostesen. I think that we shall have to return. And so hame is a Doric or Iolic form of the first person plural personal pronoun. I think we shall have to return. So, reading Smythe 1972. In general, the subject of the infinitive, if expressed at all, stands in the accusative. When the subject of the infinitive is the same as the subject or object of the governing verb, that is the verb of speaking or finding or saying, or when it has already been made known in the sentence, it is not repeated with the infinitive. So oftentimes you will not have a repetition of the subject if it's already been mentioned. But then you have this case described in 1973, when the subject of the infinitive is the same as that of the governing verb, it is omitted, and the predicate noun stands in the accusative, in the nominative case, and the predicate noun stands in the nominative case. So, oio sa oteros aponostesen, I believe that I shall more safely return home. This sa oteros is nominative because the speaker, I think, is referring to himself, and so it refers back to the subject of oio. I am thinking that I will more safely return home. So, besides this type 1A with the infinitive, we have type 1B, which is indirect discourse with the participle. And so here we have, go back to what we discussed earlier as the supplementary participle, Smythe 2089. The supplementary participle agrees either with the subject or with the object of the main verb. With the subject when the verb is intransitive or passive, with the object when the verb is transitive. So here, just going to our earlier example in Book 1, me kikeo se de thunonta. Don't let me find you, we have the accusative subject, hanging about, de thunonta. Whereas, reading A, when the object is the same as the subject, it is commonly suppressed, and the participle agrees with the subject, that is, the subject of the introductory verb. So we have the example, oro ex armatano. I see that I err. This being taken from Euripides' Medea. I see that I am in error. Horo ex armatanon. So this ex armatanon is a nominative, is your nominative masculine singular participle, referring to the masculine subject who of horo, I see. So the participle occurs in indirect discourse with various types of verbs. And first we have the class of verbs of knowing and showing. So Smythe 2106. Verbs of knowing and showing. After verbs signifying to know, to be ignorant of, to learn, to remember, to forget, to show, to appear, to approve, to acknowledge, or to announce, the participle represents a dependent statement, each tense having the same force as the corresponding tense of the indicative or optative with hos or haughty. The present will include the imperfect, and the perfect will include the pluperfect. So such verbs, he gives a list of verbs that are the main verbs that express these ideas. Oida, no, gignosko, no, epistamai, etc. And these verbs are very important to familiarize oneself with. And then you have the participle used with verbs of perception. So Smythe 2110. Verbs signifying to see, to perceive, to hear, and to learn, i.e., learn by inquiry, hear of. When they denote physical, actual perception, take the participle. When they denote intellectual perception, they may take the participle or haughty/hos with a finite verb. And Homeric usage is less strict in that distinction. But the main verbs he cites are horo, aistanomai, and akuo, and then puntanomai. To see, horo, perceive, aistanomai, hear, akuo, and puntanomai, to learn, or I learn. Likewise, and we've already seen this, the participle can fulfill verbs of finding. Verbs of finding and detecting, like eurisco, catalambano, and the passive haliskomai, I am caught, stealing the chicken, in their capacity as verbs of perceiving, take the participle. This can occur A, not in indirect discourse, of an act or state in which a person or thing is found, or B, in indirect discourse, of the fact that a person or thing is found in a state or act. And this is really subtle. He says that, the difference between A and B, in or outside of indirect discourse, boils down to the subtle difference between direct knowledge of a state of affairs in the world or indirect knowledge through a third-person report of such a state. In which case, the report, the main verb, denotes intellectual perception. But as Smythe admits, it is often difficult to distinguish the two constructions. So here we're getting into some fine slicing of the grammarians, which really, needn't cause you to lose your hair. Okay, so Smythe has a nice little statement about the genesis of the use of the participle in indirect discourse in 2109. He says, the use of the participle to represent a dependent statement comes from its circumstantial use. Thus in Ugar ede san auton tethnekonta, the accusative perfect participle singular, agrees with the object of edestan, i.e. it agrees with auton. And so, from they did not know him as dead, the thought passes into they did not know the fact that he was dead. Okay, so this knowledge of the fact, that makes it indirect discourse, as opposed from direct knowledge of his deadness. Again, very subtle distinction and something you don't have to worry too much about. Now, the finite cases that we've talked about with on, in particular the potential optative and the past tenses with on denoting irreality, these can be expressed as well in these forms of indirect discourse that use the infinitive or participle, because the infinitive and participle too can take on. So it's my 1845. The infinitive or participle with on represents either the past tense of the indicative with on or the optative with on. The context determines whether the indicative or the optative is met. And this participle with on is post-Homeric, so you won't see it in Homer. Now, so 1846, the present infinitive or participle with on represents the imperfect indicative with on or the present optative with on. Whereas the aorist infinitive or participle with on represents the aorist indicative with on or the aorist optative with on. And again, these are the fine slicings of grammarians. And when you get, actually in Greek literature, this all falls together quite well once you get used to those native senses of on with the optative being potential and on with the past tenses of the indicative being unreal or contrary to fact. So our final type, actually, the third type of way of expressing indirect statement is with the use of hos or haughty plus a finite verb. So this is the one that comes most naturally to us. He said that he was, flying to Chicago tomorrow. So in this case, you have changes that can occur depending on whether the introductory verb is a primary or secondary tense verb. So reading Smythe 2597, simple and compound sentences and the principal clauses of complex sentences introduced by haughty and or hos are treated as follows. After primary tenses, the original mood and tense are retained, except that the person of the verb may be changed. So if I said, I'm flying to Chicago tomorrow, you'd say, oh, he said he was flying to Chicago tomorrow. And then 2599, but after secondary tenses, the primary tenses of the indicative and all subjunctives may be changed to the same tense of the optative, but an indicative denoting unreality, with or without on, is retained. Imperfects and pluperfects are generally retained. Okay, so again, this hos, haughty with the nominative subject and a finite or conjugated verb, this is our third way of expressing indirect discourse, and a quite common way. And so, to reiterate, after primary tenses, the verb of the direct form remains unchanged in mood and tense. So we have lege dos hubristes emi. He says that I am an insolent person. Lege, he says, hos hubristes emi, that I am, an insolent person. That stands for the direct speech, hubristes a, you are insolent. And you can look at the rest of these examples at your leisure. But after secondary tenses, an indicative without on usually becomes optative, but may remain unchanged. an indicative with on and an optative with on are usually retained. So the optative for the indicative, they recognized that their fears were groundless, egnosan hoti kanos ho pobos aa, and etc. So these are things you have to worry about, but they really aren't that difficult once you get into the literature. Now, you also have certain rules of what happens to subordinate clauses in indirect discourse, and these are rules that, again, when you're reading actual Greek, this pretty much just works itself out in your mind pretty evidently, but your issues come if you're unlucky enough to find yourself in an advanced Greek composition course, turning English into Greek, and you have a sadistic teacher who has you doing passages where there's a lot of subordinate clauses that you have to transform. Well, then you're just in trouble and have to attend to these rules and pull your hair out late at night to try to figure out what the hell you're going to turn into him or her. But under normal circumstances, these are not really things you have to worry about. But let's read these anyways. 2601. Subordinate clauses of complex sentences introduced by hos or hoti are treated as follows. 1. Subordinate clauses of a sentence introduced by a leading verb in the primary tense must remain unchanged in mood and tense. Whew, that's nice to know. But if subordinate clauses are introduced by a leading verb in secondary tense, all primary tenses of the indicative and all subjunctives, with or without on, may, i.e. may, be changed to the corresponding tenses of the optative without on, whereas all secondary tenses of the indicative, with or without on, remain unchanged. So that's really not that bad. You just have the possibility of changing an indicative or subjunctive to an optative, whereas your secondary tenses will mainly remain unchanged. But like I say, when you're actually reading Greek, this stuff works itself out pretty well. Okay, so finally, just to overview our constructions, Smythe 2592. The constructions of indirect discourse are regulated by the character of the leading verb or expression. So we find that A, verbs of saying take either hoti or hos and the finite verb, or the infinitive with the accusative subject. B, most verbs of thinking and believing just take the straightforward infinitive with the accusative subject. C, most verbs of knowing, perceiving, hearing, and showing take the participle, but they can admit the construction of hos or hoti, and some are followed by the infinitive. So that's where you kind of get all three as possibilities when you're talking about knowing, perceiving, hearing, or showing. And then he has a final note pointing you to the sections where you have verbs of hoping, promising, swearing. I promised, blah, blah, blah. And so you can consult those sections 1868, 1999, and 2024. Okay? But really, the bottom line here is that you just have to be aware for, verb of speaking, followed by the infinitive with its accusative subject, followed by the participle with its accusative or nominative subject, or followed by hos, hoti with a finite verb. So these are the three constructions you have to have ready to go in your mind in order to be able to handle the full range of indirect discourse once you get beyond Homer, where who, as I said at the beginning, is largely committed to having his characters speak directly. Okay, so again, that's a lot, but I was considering looking at the beginning of Book 2 of the Republic, just so you guys would get a taste of what these rules really look like in action. If I get a comment that someone is interested in that, I will perhaps do that. Otherwise, I'll just keep going through Homer and Pharr. Okay, take care, have a great day, and thank you for being interested.